Block the creek. If he interferes, remove him.
Diane Caldwell pointed, and the excavator dumped another load of rock into my creek, on my land. 2 HOA guards stepped in front of me. "Touch that machine and I'll have you arrested." I didn't argue. I asked one question. "Where's your federal permit?" She didn't answer. She didn't have to, because the illegal dam wasn't what eventually destroyed Diane. It was why she needed it built in the first place. The excavator kept moving. Another bucket of limestone dropped into the channel, and muddy water curled around it in a hard brown line. Behind the machine, 3 dump trucks waited with more stone. One of my survey stakes was already crushed beneath the tracks. I looked past the security guards at Diane. "Who authorized your contractor to cross my boundary?" She tapped the clipboard against her palm. "The HOA board authorized the project." That wasn't my question. Her smile thinned. "This creek serves the entire community, Mr. Mercer. We're creating a controlled water feature that will improve drainage and property values." I pointed toward the fence. "Your HOA ends 80 feet that way." One guard moved closer. Diane didn't. She had that calm expression people use when they think the argument is already over. "You're making this more difficult than it needs to be." That told me everything I needed to know. She didn't see me as the landowner. She saw me as the obstruction. I took out my phone. I photographed the crushed survey marker, the excavator, every truck, the contractor logo. Then Diane herself standing beside the construction. She laughed. "Take all the pictures you want." I nodded. I planned to. I'd spent 32 years working drainage and excavation jobs, culverts, retention systems, washouts, storm channels. I knew one thing Diane apparently didn't. When somebody starts moving thousands of pounds of material into flowing water, the most dangerous thing on the site usually isn't the excavator. It's the paper trail. And Diane had already started building one. That creek had crossed my family's property since long before Hawthorne Ridge existed. My father bought the land in 1978. Back then, there were no stone subdivision signs, no architectural committees, no HOA president talking about community character. Just 43 acres, cottonwoods, an old workshop, and water. Dad taught me how to read that creek. After a storm, he'd stand beside it and say, "Water remembers where it belongs." I followed him into excavation work when I was young. Later, I spent 3 decades building culverts, repairing washouts, and fixing drainage projects, designed by people who never bothered watching where the water actually went. When Dad died, the property came to me. I kept his workshop, his old bench by the cottonwood, even the hand-painted elevation marks he'd put on one bridge post during the flood of '92. That creek wasn't a decorative feature to me. It was part of the land, and Diane knew I wouldn't sell it. 2 years earlier, she'd asked to buy the eastern strip. I refused. 6 months after that, she wanted a recreational easement. I refused again. So when an excavator showed up, I knew this wasn't confusion. She had asked. I had said no, and now she was building anyway. That night I pulled my deed, the newest survey, and an easement my father had signed in 1988. Diane had apparently found that easement too. She just hadn't read all of it. The next morning, my neighbor Tom Alvarez brought me a glossy brochure. Tom lived inside Hawthorne Ridge, but he'd never been impressed by Diane. The cover showed a blue lake surrounded by expensive houses. Across the top were 3 words, Crystal Falls at Hawthorne Ridge. There was a stone waterfall exactly where my creek crossed the boundary. Where did you get this? HOA meeting. I flipped through it. Premium waterfront lots. Permanent lake views. Signature community water feature. Then I saw the special assessment. Homeowners were paying thousands each toward the project. The developer still owned 17 lots around the proposed lake. Those lots were now being marketed at a premium. Tom tapped one paragraph. They told us you approved it. I looked up. They said that? Diane said the neighboring landowner had signed off. Now we had crossed another line. She wasn't only building on land she didn't own. She was using my supposed consent to sell the project. I turned the brochure over. A small line listed project consultants. One company name caught my eye. Caldwell Community Strategies. I looked at Tom. Caldwell? He shrugged. Never heard of them. Neither had I. But I remembered the name. Because Diane's last name was Caldwell, too. Then Tom showed me the sentence that mattered most. Permanent community-controlled water feature. I handed the brochure back. She can't control what she doesn't own. And suddenly the speed of the construction started making sense. Somebody needed Crystal Falls finished before anybody started asking who actually controlled the water. Diane came to my house the next afternoon with the HOA attorney. She put a copy of the 1988 easement on the hood of my truck. Your father granted us drainage access. She'd highlighted one sentence. The HOA had access rights for inspection, clearing, and emergency maintenance of the existing drainage culvert. Diane pointed at the words. There. Authority. I pushed the page back. Read the next paragraph. Her attorney did. His expression changed. The next section prohibited permanent structures and alterations unrelated to maintaining the existing drainage function. I asked, Is a landscaped waterfall emergency culvert maintenance? Her attorney stayed quiet. Diane didn't. Our legal interpretation is broader than yours. I glanced at the lawyer. Is it broader than his? That irritated her. I asked another question. Where's the document showing I approved Crystal Falls? She crossed her arms. The HOA isn't required to negotiate every improvement with one hostile adjacent owner. Then why did you tell the residents I signed off? For the first time, she hesitated. 1 second. Maybe less. But her attorney noticed. So did I. Diane gathered the papers. You're not stopping a project that benefits hundreds of families. I pointed toward the creek. I'm not the one who built it on somebody else's land. She left angry. I made copies of the easement. Because Diane had just changed her position. First, I supposedly approved the project. Now, my approval supposedly wasn't necessary. Both statements couldn't be true. 2 days later, the argument stopped being about paperwork. I woke before 6 and heard equipment. When I reached the creek, the temporary dam had been raised again. The water had backed farther onto my property overnight. It reached the roots of 3 cottonwoods my father had planted. One section of fence was underwater. A contractor was setting orange stakes another 20 feet inside my boundary. I walked toward him. Stop. He pointed toward Diane's white SUV. She approved the elevation. Diane stepped out carrying coffee. The water level is exactly where our engineer designed it. That tree line is on my survey. The final shoreline requires stabilization. On my property. She took a slow sip. The water doesn't care where your survey line is. I stared at her. No, but your contractor should. Then I saw one worker pulling another survey stake from the ground so the loader could pass. I raised my phone. Put that back. Diane stepped between us. You've documented enough, Mr. Mercer. No, You just gave me something new to document. I filmed the flooded fence, the uprooted stake, the elevation of the water against Dad's old bridge post, and the worker replacing the marker after he realized the camera was running. Diane came close enough that only I could hear her. People like you always think owning dirt makes you important. That was the first time she stopped pretending this was about drainage. I looked at the water reaching Dad's cottonwoods, then at her. I don't need to be important. I held up my phone. I just need this to be accurate. That afternoon, I started searching for permits. And that was when Crystal Falls developed a much bigger problem. I searched county records first, then state records, then the federal references I knew from my years in excavation. I found permits for grading around the new subdivision, stormwater approvals, road work, landscaping, but nothing matching a permanent dam and large quantities of fill at my coordinates. No authorization number was posted at the site either. So I called the regional regulatory office. I gave the woman the coordinates and described what was happening. Rock placement, concrete, a new impoundment, permanent waterfall construction. She asked, "What permit number are they working under?" I was hoping you could tell me. Silence. Then she said, "Send me the photographs." I sent 23. The flooded cottonwoods, the crushed marker, the fill, the survey, the easement. 2 days later, a regulatory specialist called. He asked how much material had been placed, whether water had been diverted, whether work was still active, whether I had authorized access. No. Then he asked for the contractor's name. I gave it to him. The next day, work stopped for 3 hours, then restarted. That told me somebody had asked questions. That night, Tom sent me a screenshot from the HOA portal. Diane had posted a message. Recent complaints from an adjacent property owner will not interfere with our lawful community improvements. Crystal Falls remains on schedule. Lawful. I read that word twice. Then I noticed another project document Tom had attached. The same consultant name appeared again. Caldwell Community Strategies. This time beside a 5-figure invoice entry. The amount wasn't visible, but now the name wasn't just a coincidence. And Diane was still pushing toward Saturday's grand opening. 3 days before the opening, I received a certified letter from the HOA. I wasn't a member. That didn't stop them. The letter accused me of interfering with community infrastructure, harassing contractors, and creating unsafe conditions adjacent to a shared water resource. I added it to the folder. That afternoon, Diane found me near the fence. "You've caused enough trouble. I haven't touched your project. Your complaints are costing our homeowners money. Then stop spending their money on my property." She looked at my truck, my boots, my work jacket, then smiled. "People like you don't understand what a project like this does for property values. People like me. You know what I mean." I did. In Diane's world, the man who repaired drainage systems was less important than the woman selling a waterfall. She told me the developer backed the project. The board backed the project. Legal counsel had already handled the permit issue. I asked, "What permit issue?" Her face changed. Not much, but enough. Then she walked away. That evening, Tom called. "You were right about Caldwell Community Strategies." I sat down. "What did you find?" "Diane's husband owns it." Then he said, "And I found the email she does not want anyone reading." That was the moment this stopped looking like a reckless HOA project. Now it had a motive. Tom sent me the email. Diane had written it to the contractor, the property manager, and 3 board members. The subject line was Crystal Falls completion deadline. 1 paragraph mattered. Finish all visible work before Saturday's event. Any remaining permit questions can be resolved after completion. We cannot jeopardize Phase 4 sales over a procedural delay. I read it again. Permit questions. So she knew. Maybe not every legal detail, but she knew there was a problem, and she told them to finish anyway. Then I opened the attachment. An invoice. Caldwell Community Strategies. $85,000. Consulting services. The company was owned by Diane's husband. Tom said the payment had never been clearly disclosed to the homeowners. I didn't know whether the payment itself broke any law. That wasn't my job to decide, but it answered the question from the beginning. Why was Diane willing to risk the project? Because Crystal Falls wasn't just her legacy. Money connected to her household had already been paid out. And Phase 4 sales depended on that lake being real. I forwarded the construction email to the regulatory contact. The financial document went to Tom and the board members who were already demanding an internal review. Then I waited. Friday evening, the waterfall turned on. Lights illuminated the stone face. Water rolled over the new ledges. From a distance, it looked beautiful. That was the dangerous part. Bad projects often look best right before the paperwork catches up. Diane sent one final neighborhood announcement. Tomorrow we celebrate the future of Hawthorne Ridge. She had no idea how accurate that was. Saturday morning looked like a luxury real estate commercial. White tents, catered food, a string quartet, SUVs parked along the new lake, a banner stretched across the lawn. Welcome to Crystal Falls. Diane stood in front of the waterfall with a microphone. Tom and I stayed behind the crowd. She thanked the board, the developer, the consultants. Then she looked toward me. And this project proves what happens when a community refuses to let one difficult individual stand in the way of progress. People applauded. Tom whispered, "She really said it." I watched the waterfall. Good. Good? She said it in front of witnesses. A realtor was telling buyers the lake was permanent. One buyer asked whether the HOA controlled the water. Absolutely, the realtor said. Then 3 government vehicles turned into the entrance. No sirens. No flashing lights. Just folders, field gear, and federal plates. Tom looked at me. Army Corps? I nodded. One of the officials walked directly toward the waterfall. Diane lowered the microphone. He looked at the structure, then the channel, then the contractor. Who is responsible for this project? Diane stepped forward. I am. Diane Caldwell, HOA President. He nodded. Who authorized placement of fill in this channel? Her smile disappeared. Diane tried to move the conversation away from the residents. The Corps regulator stayed where he was. He asked for the federal authorization number. The contractor superintendent looked at Diane. Diane looked at the property manager. Nobody answered. Finally, she said, "This is a private community water feature. Our council has handled all approvals." The regulator looked toward the dam. Who owns the land beneath that structure? Diane gestured toward the subdivision. The HOA controls the water. He looked back at her. I asked who owns the ground. Silence. I stepped forward. I do, Diane snapped. He has been interfering with this project from the beginning. The regulator asked me, "Do you have documentation?" I handed him the survey. Then the deed. Then the easement. He matched the map to the site. Diane pointed at the easement. That gives us drainage authority. He read the first paragraph, then the second. No permanent structures. Her attorney had arrived by then. He said nothing. Then the contractor superintendent spoke. We requested written confirmation before final placement. Diane turned sharply. That is not what happened. The superintendent held up his phone. I have your email. That was the first blow. The deed killed her ownership argument. The missing authorization killed her permit defense. And her own email killed the idea that nobody had raised concerns. The Corps regulator ordered the work stopped pending resolution and restoration requirements. The waterfall was switched off. 1 second it was roaring behind Diane. The next, there was only dripping water. Then the regulator said something else. Because the matter involved unauthorized fill and potential Clean Water Act violations, enforcement information would also be referred through the federal process involving the EPA. That was the first time Diane looked genuinely afraid. The Corps was looking at the structure. The EPA would be looking at the violation. And everyone standing there had just heard both. Crystal Falls had been built to make Diane look powerful. Now it looked like a federal exhibit. The waterfall did not disappear the next morning. There were inspections, measurements, site reviews, contractor records, photos, emails. The Corps required a restoration plan addressing the unauthorized work. The HOA had already spent nearly $1 million creating Crystal Falls. Now it had to pay contractors again, this time to undo it. 3 weeks later, the excavator returned. The same machine, the same creek, the same rock. Only the direction had changed. The decorative cap came off first. Then sections of concrete facing. Then the large boulders. Truck after truck carried away material that had been brought in only weeks earlier. I stood beside Dad's cottonwood and watched the water change. The level behind the dam started dropping. Slowly at first, then fast enough to see. The artificial shoreline retreated. One floating dock tilted sideways. Fresh sod that had been installed along the lakefront now ended above a strip of wet mud. And the enormous Crystal Falls sign stood over a landscape that no longer had any falls. Diane arrived around noon. No white blazer, no clipboard. She stood behind the construction fence with her arms crossed. For once, nobody was waiting for her instructions. One worker hooked a chain around the largest decorative stone near the center. The excavator pulled. The stone rolled free. Water pushed through the opening. The creek found its old path. Dad had been right. Water remembers where it belongs. By sunset, the centerpiece Diane had unveiled with champagne was gone. Not closed. Not delayed. Gone. But as brutal as that looked, the waterfall itself was not the punishment Diane feared most. Because while the Corps was restoring the creek, the EPA side of the file was still moving. Once residents saw the restoration bill, they demanded the complete project records. That put everything on the same table. The special assessment, construction overruns, legal costs, restoration expenses, the $85,000 Caldwell Community Strategies invoice, and Diane's email. Finish all visible work before Saturday. Any remaining permit questions can be resolved after completion. She tried to explain the consulting payment as legitimate. Board members asked where the conflict had been disclosed. She couldn't show them. She blamed the contractor. The contractor produced the full email chain. She blamed me. My photographs showed I never touched the equipment. She said nobody warned her. The records showed questions had been raised before the grand opening. Then the EPA enforcement result arrived. The civil settlement and penalties tied to the unauthorized Clean Water Act violations came to $250,000. At the emergency HOA meeting, the treasurer read the number aloud. Nobody spoke. Finally, a homeowner in the front row asked, "That's $250,000 on top of restoration?" The treasurer nodded. "Yes." "And the legal bills?" "Yes." "And what we already paid to build it?" Another pause. "Yes." That was when the room changed. People stopped looking at the treasurer. They looked at Diane. Tom stood. "Why did your husband's company receive $85,000 from this project?" Diane said the meeting was not the proper forum for discussing private business arrangements. Someone laughed. Then a woman near the aisle said, "You used HOA money." Another homeowner stood. "You told us Caleb approved the project." Another voice came from the back. "You told us the permits were handled. One fact at a time." Diane lost the room. "Not because I gave a speech. I never stood up. I didn't need to. Her own documents were speaking for me." By the end of the meeting, Diane resigned. The remaining board authorized an independent financial audit and began reviewing whether disputed project expenditures could be recovered. Diane had spent months telling everyone the creek was a shared asset. In the end, the only thing the entire neighborhood truly shared was the cost of her decision. By fall, Crystal Falls barely existed outside photographs and invoices. The creek bank had been stabilized. Native grasses came back. Willows were planted where the heavy equipment had torn the soil apart. The new HOA board changed its procedures. Any future project involving private land or an easement required independent legal review. Major vendor relationships had to be disclosed. Financial reports became available to homeowners. Tom joined an oversight committee. I stayed out of it. I'd had enough meetings for one lifetime. One Saturday morning, I carried coffee down to Dad's old bench. The creek was clear again. No lights, no stone waterfall, no marketing banners, just water moving between ordinary rocks. A family from Hawthorne Ridge walked along the public trail farther downstream. Their little boy looked toward me. "Wasn't there a big waterfall here?" His father looked embarrassed. I smiled. For a little while. What happened? I looked at the creek. Somebody built it where it didn't belong. That was all he needed. Diane had believed enough money could turn ownership into an inconvenience. She believed an HOA vote could replace permission. She believed that if the waterfall was finished before anybody stopped her, the project would become too expensive to undo. She was wrong about all three. Every load of rock created another photograph. Every payment created another record. Every email created another witness. And the monument she built to prove how powerful she was became the clearest evidence against her. I never had to beat Diane at her own game. I just had to let her keep playing long enough for everyone else to see the rules she was breaking. Because a clipboard can look powerful across a conference table. But it doesn't change a deed. It doesn't erase a federal permit. And it definitely doesn't stop a creek.